What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to another live stream vlog episode. As with last week, to give you a little background real quick. I have done vlogs last year, every week or two, something to that effect, and got an upgraded internet connection where I could actually live stream, and so I am giving this a shot instead of trying to do pre-recorded vlogs. In this episode, I'm going to be talking a little bit about how episode 1 went. I'm going to be talking about some other aspects of caring about your work, focusing on technology, that kind of thing. I'm going to talk briefly about audio recorders and stuff, something I've talked about in the past. A little bit about what I'm currently working on, which is a project looking at teleconverters versus upresing, and I'm going to be talking about some lighting stuff. A lot of stuff, not everything's going to be super in-depth because, well, it's a vlog type thing, and so on and so forth. So, let's talk about, let me make sure this is working. Yes. Okay. So let's talk about how last week's episode went. So last week's episode was the first episode that I had done as a live stream. I'm using OBS Studio as my broadcasting software. I'm using Canon's EOS utility, our EOS webcam utility, to feed the camera signal into the computer. So the image quality is not as good as it would be if I was running at full 1080p, HDMI, native, etc. But I learned a bunch of things, and that's what I want to talk about here, because if you're going to do this kind of thing, well, you're going to learn things, and finding stuff out from people is definitely something that's kind of advantageous. So, the first thing that really became immensely obvious to me is how much of a pain in the rear cognitive load is. How much of an impediment it can be, how difficult it can be to work with or to work around. And yes, you can practice and you can work on that and you can improve and get better at dealing with multiple things going on simultaneously, but especially when there's a time critical factor. So when I was recording these as a pre-recorded video recorded to the card on the camera, I was subject to the, what do you want to call it? The 30-minute time limit. So that was something that I ran into as an issue constantly. Like, I couldn't get lost in talking about whatever it was that I was covering. I had to focus on, and I apologize, unfortunately, what's going to happen probably through the course of this video at least twice is my camera is going to drop out and reset. And the video is going to pause, and then the video is going to come back, and everything's going to resume. Unfortunately, this is a side effect of something in either the Canon EOS webcam utility or I'm not really sure. This happened twice in the first episode. It's already happened once in this episode. Again, I apologize. I'm trying to figure out what's going on. As best I can tell, it's not a power problem. My batteries are fully charged. The camera's fully ready to go. It's not an overheating problem. There are no temperature issues or anything like that. It seems like it is just something involved in the EOS webcam utility or the camera or something. Although I have, for example, I have the sleep timer turned off, so the camera shouldn't be shutting down for any reason during the recording or powering off, unless, of course, it ran out of power. So again, I apologize for that. I'm working on a better solution than using the EOS webcam utility for these vlogs. When I figure that out, I will be using it. So going back to what I was saying about cognitive load, uh, I'm always telling people when they're looking for cameras, find a camera whose user interface gives you the least amount of frustration, because that's a good indicator of cognitive load. How much time your mind is having to spend thinking about things. And so, like I said, the problem with having, say, for example, a 30-minute record timer is I'm constantly having to look at how much time's remaining. Do I have to stop and restart? And then anytime I have a place where I have to stop and I have to restart because of that record timer or that record limit, or I have to remember where I was. I have to remember my train of thought. And all of this corresponds to really having a lot of stuff going on in my head. So I'm really having to think about all of these things, and what I found is that resulted in me saying a heck of a lot more than even I do in normal conversation. I pretty much ever since I was in high school and I took debate, I have sort of squashed and other audible pauses as much as I can from my speaking. And when I speak in person, when I speak even in front of a group of people, I will pause just quietly to collect my thoughts instead of stammering and saying and. That wasn't something that I could do when I was recording these videos. I had so much going on in my head because of the record timers and all of these things, that it just totally crashed all of my sort of mental circuitry on what I was doing, how to present, how to frame my train of thought and keep it on process. And so this is something that's really sort of valuable, I think, in sort of general, for if you're going to do any kind of recording, presentation, whatever, is if it's something you want to do seriously and it's something you want to do for an extended period of time, you really, I think, need to look for or look into a camera that allows or setup. It doesn't necessarily have to be a camera specifically. So like Panasonic cameras, for instance, have unlimited record times, and I think some of the Sony Alphas now have unlimited record times. But you could always stick a standalone auto or recorder like a Tomos Ninja on your Canon or Nikon camera and essentially have record times that just, run unlimitedly. Hello, Pantherflow. Thanks for joining the video. And there I go, I say as I'm getting distracted. I would love for Canon to offer a unlimited record time. I mean, I would even pay them for, $100 or $200 or something like that to have an unlimited record time upgrade for the R5. It's just, it's one of those things that, especially if you're a lone wolf and you have to work through a whole crap ton of different things, it's just, that's something that's so much phenomenally just takes one of those things away. It's actually trying to minimize the cognitive load is one of the reasons I went for or bought a Zoom F6 for an audio recorder, because with the full 32-bit float recording process, including the dual ADCs, I didn't have to worry so much about where my audio levels were set. And if I messed something up, I could be pretty confident that there would be audio levels, or would be something to record, and it wouldn't just be clipping. So cognitive load, gear, etc. Do you need, if you're going to live stream, do you really need an AC to DC power adapter for your camera or super big batteries? I don't really think so. I'm considering maybe getting one for this setup, but the reality is that I did an hour-long live stream last week, and I'm doing this live stream, and I've only lost about 25% of the battery capacity or charge level in the dual batteries in my 5D Mark IV. And I think you can get by with batteries, or at least I think I can get by with batteries. Following along with my notes on that too, one of the things that frustrates me in all of my videos, I like to have timestamps, because especially people coming in and watching it after the fact, timestamps, and especially with the new chapters in YouTube, make it incredibly easy to skip through content to something you're interested in. And since I do a lot of things in the vlog, I cover a lot of ground potentially, being able to jump to a point 10 or 15 minutes in is a problem, or is useful, I should say. So not having timestamp generation out of the gate is, or markers or something out of the gate, is was kind of a challenge. I found an OBS Studio plugin for that, which I subsequently didn't add to my notes, so I can't tell you the name without going and digging it up, and I don't want to interrupt the vlog that much for it. But it lets you map a hotkey on the keyboard to generate timestamps. It creates an EDL file, and then you can, go through, pull out your scene transitions, or whatever it is that you want to call those timestamps, and pretty quickly get that into the comments in YouTube so that you have timestamps. And that's what I'm going to be using from now on for these vlogs, to get good timestamps done. All that said, I definitely think there's room to improve. Like so many things in content production, media, talking to people, doing things, practice is such an important thing to basically get comfortable and learn and understand and adapt. So, the more you do this, if you're out there and you're thinking about vlogging, or you're thinking about doing some kind of video production, or really kind of anything, is you got to practice it. You got to do it. And you got to do it. I've found personally, you have to do it in where there's stakes, which is why why I started doing vlogs a year ago, or 2 years ago now maybe, and why I'm doing these live streams. And my attitude really is, yeah, I'm not going to be perfect, and I'm probably going to screw things up, and there's probably going to be production issues. But what I found is that if you don't have a stake, if it's not, I stream every Friday at 10:30, or whatever you want to do, I'm going to put up a video every 2 weeks, whatever it is. If you don't have stakes, you will just absolutely procrastinate the heck out of it. You will pretty much just, at least this was the case for me. I said, oh, I'll shoot a video, and even if I just delete it, I will at least have shot it and practiced it. And then I would just never shoot the video, because there was no stake in doing that and actually producing it. So practice and set up stakes. Give yourself something that you have to, or you want to, or have to produce and put out there, and that will make you better. At least that's been my experience, is that will absolutely make you better. So moving on from a recap of what I learned from last week, I want to talk about one of the points. Actually, it's sort of a stupid correction, but I was talking about the EOS M series last week, and why I think it was maybe not a great idea for Canon to decide to get rid of the EOS Ms potentially this year. At least that's what the rumor mill's been talking about. And I described sort of this ideal EOS M video camera for me. I called it the Cinema EOS M. That was basically, well, it was basically an M6 Mark II, but I forgot about the M6 Mark II and its capabilities. And so basically, in a lot of ways, I realized pretty much after I did that video that if Canon put that unlimited recording time in like the M6 Mark II, that would be a perfect companion camera as a video tool, to somebody who's shooting video on a like EOS R5 or R6. So, I don't know. like I said, didn't want to talk about it an awful lot, but I wanted to mention that because if somebody watches that and then watches this episode, at least they'll know that I'm not completely forgetting about the M6 Mark II, which, if Canon does in fact decide this year to discontinue the EOS M line, again, as the rumor mills are suggesting, that is definitely something I want to probably pick up, because I like my M3 as a super tiny portable camera, and the M6 Mark II looks like it would be a pretty good upgrade from the M3 in that role that I use that camera. Okay, so this is moving on. This is kind of a complex topic in some respects, because I've come at it from two different directions. So one side of it is caring about what you do and understanding what it is you need to improve and what you need to work on, and where you can invest pretty much time, but even more so time and money, into improving your photography, your videography, your production, whatever it is that you want to call it. And the other side of it is something that I've noticed that kind of frustrates the crap out of me now with the way digital photography has gone. And I think I'm going to start there, which is to say that one thing that I find frustrates the crap out of me in actually a lot of places, computers, photography, artwork, I should say camera gear, is there has become this tremendous focus on technology and the the spec sheets for technology and how the technology is made. And it's being done by people, you know, and I completely get this to a certain degree. So when I was in high school, I was super interested in computers, and I would, like, when Intel announced the Northwood Pentium 4 architecture, I ran out and bought and built a Northwood Pentium 4 because it was interesting from a technology perspective. That also taught me a lesson, which was, I built the computer, I played a couple games on it, and it wasn't more powerful than my workstation at the time, so it was just another computer for me, and it sat idle and did nothing. And, you know, it's cool to say to an extent that, well, I had bought this interesting technology, but I didn't engineer it, I didn't design it, I didn't make it, because, you know, when push comes to shove, building a computer is really just assembling stuff that somebody else manufactured. And you know, that's not, I mean, that's not to say that it's not rewarding. It, you know, certainly can be, but it's not as rewarding as, say, designing and building something from the ground up. And as I said, it taught me that this idea that if you're not putting something to use, having something that's cool for technology reasons isn't as valuable as I think I thought it was, and I would argue that as many people might think it is. You know, so I see things, for example, I watch Linus Tech Tips videos because I'm still kind of into computers, and he does some interesting things. And I see a lot of instances where computer enthusiasts are talking about, say, Intel versus AMD versus Apple or whatever, and they start talking about, well, yeah, but Intel's still using 14 nanometers, and somebody else is, you know, AMD's on 7 or whatever. And that's this defining thing. You're not talking about what you can and can't do with the, or they're not talking entirely about what they can and can't do with the part. They're concerned about what fabrication process it was built with. Another perfect example of this, and to bring it back to photography, is I have seen people on various discussion forums, Canon Rumors and other places, state things like, I will not buy another Canon camera until they start using backside illuminated sensors. So what? Why? Like, the EOS R5 right now, if you go look at, say, photonstophotos.net, is class leading. Even DxOMark has basically said that it is the sensor to beat. There's one sensor that I've seen right now, full frame, 35 millimeter sized, that edges it out in dynamic range at very low ISOs, and that's Panasonic's S1, one of the Panasonic ones. And of course, obviously, like, the Sony A6R4 has higher resolution, but it doesn't beat it in dynamic range. And so, and the A6R4, and for that matter, the Z7, is not doing 20 frames per second at 45 or 44 to 45 megapixels. So does it matter that the sensor in the R5 isn't backside illuminated? Well, I'd argue no. That if Canon can get that kind of performance out of, whatever technology they're using, well, you could make the argument, sure, that, well, if it was backside illuminated X, it would be better. Possibly it could be, but on the same token, not being backside illuminated is certainly not hamstringing the sensor to, beyond, how do I want to put it, beyond reasonable performance characteristics or limitations. And in the end, the question really is, what matters? Is the way the sensor's manufactured, does that matter? Does having a backside illuminated sensor mean that you're going to be able to go out and take better pictures? I mean, I've seen people, argue left, right, and center about, well, more dynamic range and blah, blah, blah. And then you ask them, well, what ISO are you shooting at? And they, oh, I shoot at 800 because of the lighting and lenses and situations. And you say, well, go look at DxOMark, or go look at photonstophotos.net and see who's where with the dynamic range at ISO 800, and you basically see everything's basically the same. So, does the technology matter compared to, well, I'm going to argue the technology doesn't matter as much or that much compared to your skill, which is sort of the second aspect of this, which is to say, if you're a serious photographer, you're seriously interested into photography, buying a new camera isn't going to make your pictures better. What's going to make your pictures better is making you better as a photographer, caring about learning about what you're doing. And I kind of say it that way because, it is caring. I've always been frustrated by the term amateur, because it has two sort of diametrically opposed definitions. So, on one hand, you have amateur, meaning doesn't make money from the thing that they're doing, so it's not their livelihood. On the other hand, you have amateur, meaning unskilled or lacking skill. And I've always felt, and it's been my well, photography is one of those weird areas in some respects. I think all art is. I don't think you can separate the artist from the job. You certainly can have non-professional artists, but I think it's really hard to have a professional artist that doesn't absolutely always is going to be taking pictures or painting or doing whatever it is that they do. So on that line of thinking, like I said, I think far more important than trying to focus on, well, I'm going to buy the new Canon XYZ or Sony XYZ because it's got higher resolution or more dynamic range or something, and that's going to let me take better pictures. you have to really focus on the fact that you're going to take better pictures, you know, and in many respects, especially now, because this is the thing, right? For the last 5, 6 years, something like that, camera gear has been good enough. Like, you can take a camera, a D850 or even a D810 or D800, and if you have, you know, if you're going out and you're looking for interesting subjects, interesting compositions, interesting color, blah, 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 you know, all of the things that make a photograph, that D800 from 2012, I think it was, something like that, is going to make a fantastic image. And in the final reckoning, in a print, people are going to be hard pressed, if not completely incapable of telling whether that is a 6, 7 year old camera or one that was made yesterday, you know, a brand new design. If you're not working on improving your skill set as a photographer, and you're hoping that you're going to get there with technology, and therefore you're focusing on the technology, it's just not going to work. You're not going to get better. And if you're, you know, I think one of the things that always frustrates me, I run into people and I see people saying, well, I need to get a new camera because it's going to make me a better photographer. No, it's not. And I think the worst part about that in some respects is you're just lying to yourself. Like, there's nothing wrong with wanting a new camera. This is an EOS R5. I pre-ordered it because I wanted a new camera. I can make up a whole slew of sort of arguments to try and rationalize why I wanted the new camera. Oh, I needed a mirrorless camera. Oh, I needed to start to, you know, to talk about it coherently, etc., etc. But when push comes to shove, I wanted a new camera. And I'm going to be honest about that. I wanted the camera, irregardless of what other aspects I could use to justify that. And, you know, so long as you can afford the thing, buying the thing because you want the new shiny toy is completely legitimate, and you should not really, shouldn't at all be ashamed or reluctant or trying to hide the fact that, hey, I bought this camera, I could afford it, I wanted it, you know. But don't think that that camera is going to make your pictures better just because you bought a new camera. That doesn't really work anymore. And truthfully, as much as I would say going from the 5D Mark III to the 5D Mark IV would be an exception to that, it's not really. I can't separate it for myself because I became a much better photographer over the time that I had the 5D Mark III. And when I got my 5D Mark IV, I settled into a lot of new avenues that I hadn't previously had access to for other reasons or been able to do for other reasons. And so my photography changed, and in some ways I feel it got better. In some ways I feel it got worse because I got more concerned about optimizing things. But the camera, as much as I see or as much as there were improvements, there were a number of places where it just didn't matter that much. So yeah, don't get too caught up on the technology, at least not for the sake of technology. So moving along, as this is actually something I ended up throwing in today, and I want to talk really briefly. Actually, it's a rehash of a thing that I've spoken about in the past, but it's a rehash of a thing that came up because of a comment made on another video, and it just, audio frustrates me. Like, I'll be straight up honest about that. I don't completely understand everything going on with audio. I don't completely understand everything that it's in a weird domain, so it's time-based really more than anything. And so I don't, like I can't look at a picture with when you start talking about audio. And so the whole thing just kind of frustrates me. And the one thing that really frustrates the heck out of me is the continued reliance on analog signal formats, or however you want to call it, to pass data from one part of the chain to the next part of the chain. And I give this example. I record with two system audio. I'm using a wireless lav mic. I run a feed from my Zoom F6 audio recorder to my camera and to get a better scratch audio signal, essentially. The audio track in my camera has been converted from analog to digital 3 times, and from digital to analog twice. So it's analog from the mic to the wireless transmitter, where it's converted to digital, where it's sent to the receiver, where it's converted back to analog, where it's piped into the recorder, where it's converted to digital, where it's converted back to analog and sent to the camera, where it's converted to digital. And to me, this is absolutely bonkers to do that. Like, once it converted to digital, it ought to be digital all the way, completely straight to the end, period, end of story. It just totally blows, like, any kind of it's totally insane to me. And, the thing is, the first reaction that I can see from people when I start talking about this is, yeah, but my Mix Pre, my Zoom F6, whatever, has these tremendously fantastic preamps and analog to digital converters, and if I'm not using them, that I'm not going to get as good of sound. And, well, yeah, but here's the problem. The preamp and the analog to digital converter in my digital wireless mic set has already clipped everything. So that when that gets converted back, there's a room for interference. And I've talked about this in other videos, that you get analog interference from some chargers if you're using Rhodes Wireless Go receiver plugged in and charging while you're recording with it. And I'm almost 100% convinced it's analog interference. I can't see any way that it could be digital interference. And that wouldn't be there if it didn't have the digital to analog step and then an analog signal to the recorder. On top of all this, analog causes this massive problem space. And this is what came up earlier again in the comment on my video earlier that I was responding to earlier today. You have at least 3 different level standards. So you have mic level, which is -60 to -40 dBV. You have consumer line level, which is -10 dBV. And you have pro line level, which is +4 dBu. And not only do you have these 3 levels, so most cameras are mic level only, but you can actually feed a lot of them a consumer line level signal, and they'll still be able to deal with it. High-end cameras like the 1DX Mark III or most of Panasonic stuff actually, have a setting in the menu where you can switch the input from mic level to line level, and they can deal with it. But you have all these different levels, and all these different levels they exist for reasons, but they all cause separate or a possible interference problem or interface problem. That's what I want to say. So if your camera doesn't take line level, you have to do something to knock that line level signal down to mic level and deal with it. And all that kind of goes away if we said, okay, we're going to just do it digital. Like, we're going to have one encumbered, open, non-encrypted digital standard to send audio data. You don't have, it's a standard. It's one thing, and the audio data goes from point A to point B to point C, and it doesn't keep getting messed with. It doesn't have this constant, every time you go from analog to digital or digital to analog, there's the possibility of messing up the signal somehow, not recording or not being able to digitize everything. Just there's always room for error. A bad circuit design, interference can crop in, or noise can crop in that, just wouldn't be there. It wasn't there in the first device, but it shows up down the line. So I want to make the argument for this. First of all, it reduces, for us as the end user, it reduces complexity. You don't have to worry about wouldn't have to worry about pad cables. You wouldn't have to worry about whether you had things set to line in or line out. You wouldn't have to worry about, if your device says it outputs at so many dBu and a next device says it inputs at so many dBV, and figuring out what that all means. Like, it makes it easier for us, the end user. Secondly, it should reduce the cost and complexity for manufacturers. Not that I'd ever expect this to be passed along to us as end users in terms of, price savings, but manufacturers could expand the range of their capabilities while sort of reducing the complexity in their devices. So potentially you don't need ADCs in your hybrid mirrorless camera or your hybrid camera, because if you want to record audio, or as good of ADCs, because if you want to record audio, you use a little external device, or you use a microphone. So like Canon and Nikon sell branded microphones. That branded microphone could have the ADC in it, and then just plug into the camera with the digital interface, and you get the signal from that. But getting rid of ADCs means, like one of the arguments that used to be made about why you can't, or how to record stuff in your cameras, is the camera companies were too stupid to know how to make good audio circuitry, which I always found a little absurd, but that was the argument. And now they're not making any audio circuitry, potentially. From a design and engineering standpoint, and this kind of goes back to reducing costs and complexity, handling a digital signal well is a lot easier than messing with analog. Analog is always subject to interference in small ways, and it's subject to interference in a way that digital signals really aren't. So digital signals either have error checking and correction in them, which of some form, which handles blocking the interference, or simply by the fact of the virtue that digital signals are, the voltage matters, but only whether the voltage is high enough to be above a threshold to be a 1, or low enough below a threshold to be a 0. It doesn't matter, like, if the voltage of the signal has a, let's just say it's a plus or minus, or a 0 volt, or anything below, call it half a volt, is a 0, and anything above, call it 1.5 volts, is a 1. And there's noise of, say, 100 millivolts or 0.1 volts. And the tolerances would actually probably be larger. There's a lot of room where that noise has to mess with the signal before you run into the problems of it messing up the signal. Whereas if you add a few millivolts to a mic level signal, you're not getting, it's actually affecting the sound that's being carried. So digital stuff, by and large, is actually easier to deal with and deal with well, whereas analog stuff has to be, you know, even though audio frequency analog signals are pretty trivial, or not trivial, but pretty easy to deal with from an electrical engineering standpoint, they are still more susceptible to having interference issues, and building the circuits is somewhat more complicated, and building them well and using the right components. And then the final point is it gives end devices, so that whatever's at the end of the chain, for example, the camera, expanded capabilities without the end device, I mean, at least in theory, in my mind, as I'm envisioning this, without them having to directly implement this stuff. So my Zoom F6 can record 32-bit float audio. If that audio is exported as a digital signal, as opposed to, or a digital bit stream, as opposed to converting it to analog and feeding it into the camera, then the camera can just plug that 32-bit audio into the video file, just straight up, multiplex it in the way the video file would normally be created. And so Canon, Nikon, Sony, Panasonic, whatever, doesn't have to worry about, oh, well, we have to have 24-bit ADCs or 32-bit ADCs or something crazy like that. The quality of the audio in the camera, I mean, certainly they're going to have some kind of audio system somewhere, but the quality of the audio in the camera, when you get into really serious recording, really serious, say, two-system audio, the quality of the audio in the camera is coming from whatever upstream device is converting it. So, like, if I'm using a wireless mic, it's the ADC, the ADC in the transmitter, a digital wireless mic. It's the ADC in the transmitter. Well, the ADC in the transmitter is already limiting the quality of the signal, period. So if I'm comfortable with that signal level, why not just make it that much easier to have it go through the entire system, and not, have to keep going back and forth. And it's not like there aren't already standards that can be leveraged for this. It doesn't have to be invented from the ground up. There is already PCM audio. It's what my recorder records. It's what my camera records. It's not, as far as I know, because it's uncompressed. It's not encumbered by patents or copyrights or anything crazy like that, and that is a perfectly acceptable standard for high quality audio. In fact, as far as I know, it's the only standard that uncompressed high quality audio people start talking about using. And then on the other side, from an interface connection standpoint, we have USB. I'm not saying USB is the ideal interface, but USB Type-C is a pretty good interface for moving data around. And I'm just throwing that out there as an idea. I can see some potential issues where USB isn't quite the right standard, but then on the same token, I can see where, you could take USB and probably tweak it some and make it work, get the standard USB special interest groups to, approve the standard and make it work as a point-to-point of peer, of equals type standard, as opposed to like the camera needing to be the controlling unit and the recorder being the controlled unit or host and device or however you want to put it. Of course, the problem with all of this is there's no motivation out there to do this, and there's probably an awful lot of jaded audio engineer people who would kick, whine, and scream about, not wanting all this digital stuff. But, it's not like digital means proprietary, because there's tons of open, non-proprietary digital standards and stuff. It really just means, it's really just sort of an issue would be an issue for people because it's different, I think. Okay, moving along. Getting towards the end. Only got one thing You know what? I'm going to talk about lighting stuff, and I'm going to just not talk so much about what I'm working on. I got some content coming that I was going to talk about, but you know what? Probably not that interesting or worth talking about. So starting this off, I want to talk a little bit about lighting because, well, lighting is super important to video and super important to photography and whatever. And something I knew but didn't think too much about beat me over the head the other day, which is grids. So I like grids. I put grids on all of my lights. I've got a Aputure Light Dome Mini with a grid. I've got another light with a grid. I've got a light behind me with a grid on it. And the reason I use grids is I don't have a tremendous amount of space for all my lighting, so barn doors, flags, that kind of approach to controlling lighting is, well, it takes up a lot of space, and that's moderately problematic for me. However, the thing that I knew but didn't really think about because I just, it wasn't, I don't know, it hit me, and I kind of just, like I said, it's one of those things where you know it, but you don't think about it kind of thing. Grids don't focus light. I see so many, I've seen so many articles because I was looking for something about grids that keep talking about how, or that talk about how grids focus the light of the beam of light of a light. Grids don't do that. Grids, a lens can focus light, a Fresnel lens, for example, can focus light, a reflector can focus light, but a grid does not focus light. What a grid does is limits a light's beam spread. And that may sound an awful lot like focusing, because in both cases the beam gets narrower and, isn't that kind of same thing? But the way they work has substantial implications on the performance of what they do, and that comes down to brightness. A grid narrows the light's beam, as you might say, so does a reflector or a lens, but it also reduces the brightness of the light. And the reason for that is because it doesn't focus light, it blocks light. And some of the light would be bouncing around and coming out, and you'd have light maybe bounce off the top of the reflector and then out the bottom of the light, and that gets intercepted by the grid and essentially blocked. So, for example, I have a 50-degree grid on the light behind me, and that grid eats 2/3 of a stop of light, even in the center of the beam. And this is the case, for all grids, regardless of whether it's a extruded aluminum type thing or a fabric grid or whatever, you're always going to lose light. So I see one of the things I see people suggest is if you're going to use grids with your lighting, then you should, you should consider whether or not that's a good idea if you're going to have to work in the field. If you have room and you need all of the power that you can get, a grid is not going to be the right idea. If you have to have lights in a small area and you can't afford stands for flags and extra gear, then grids really do become useful. And that's why I use grids. And that's why I kind of would, I won't say recommend them, but, there's something that's worth sort of paying attention to. And hey, I'm actually impressed. I've made it all the way this far in this video, and the camera's only cut out once, which is better than last week. So the other thing I want to talk about is, with respect to light, is lighting devices. So I recently upgraded my key light from a rather cobbled together solution of a photo softbox and some LED lamps that I bought on Amazon to an Aputure LS 120D Mark II, and, like I said, a Light Dome 2 Mini. And this doesn't apply per se specifically to Aputure's light, but kind of applies to everything with respect, or in the lighting technology band these days. So if you went back, or you go back to, and this is something I've had a real challenge with coming to video from and continuous lighting from photography too. So if you go back to tungsten, standard photo flood tungsten lights, because of the way physics works, always have a color temperature of about 32,000 or 3,200 Kelvin. HMI lights, they've got another name somewhere, but because of the way a mercury vapor arc light works, always has a color temperature around 5,600 Kelvin. Flashes for photography, and this is one of those things that doesn't really matter what the brand is. Flashes for photography, you can have a Canon flash, a Nikon flash, and some Chinese $15 thing, and because it's a flash tube, it's always going to produce a color temperature around 5,600 Kelvin. Switch to fluorescence, switch to LEDs, and all of this goes out the window. And I'm not even talking about like quality of light, because you can get really crap LEDs, you can get really good LEDs. You know, even the best LEDs aren't perfect representations of tungsten or daylight or something like that. So, you know, ignoring the color quality thing. Question one, what's daylight? What color temperature is a daylight LED? I've seen brands that advertise 5,000 Kelvin as daylight. I've seen brands that advertise 5,500 Kelvin as daylight. I've seen brands that 5,600 Kelvin. I've seen stuff as high as 6,000 Kelvin. I've even seen 6,500 Kelvin for daylight, which, you know, depending on, I mean, admittedly, daylight isn't a constant of color in general. So, you know, it's not to say that they're wrong for calling 5,500 Kelvin versus say 6,500 Kelvin, you know, a daylight thing. But then I find an awful lot of LED manufacturers simply just advertise it as daylight. And then you're left on your own to hopefully figure out what color temperature that is. Well, if it's a good brand like Light Panels or Aputure or ARRI, or I'm sure there's other ones out there, there's a good chance that, you know, they'll have the information and you'll have something reasonable. The light storms from Aputure are 5,500 Kelvin. Their new AMRAM Arman, I'm not even sure what the brand, what the model names are anymore, but they just released that are relatively cost effective are 5,600 Kelvin. But then you start getting into the cheap light panel stuff like that you find on Amazon, and daylight can be 6,500 Kelvin. And you, because of these differences, and when, you know, 100 Kelvin is not that big of a deal in my experience, shooting these videos, shooting things. Yeah, sometimes you can see a little bit of a color shift, but from 5,500 to 5,600 or something like that. But it's not tremendously over the top. And even say a 500 Kelvin difference, depending on how your lighting is, it can be okay. 1,000 Kelvin's a problem. In fact, 500 Kelvin is probably a problem most of the time too. You know, unless you have a specific setup where the two, you're not trying to blend the two color temperatures directly, like on a person or something like that. But you can't just drop a 6,500 Kelvin light next to a 5,500 Kelvin light, turn them on and shoot with that. They have to be matched. You have to gel one or do whatever and, you know, deal with that. And honestly, it's like, that's frustrating to me, because coming to videography from flashes, I could just use whatever flash, it didn't matter. And now I have to make sure the brand is the same advertised color temperature. And actually, it's kind of more annoying than that, because there can be magenta casts or green casts that have to be dealt with, and those the LED modules that say Aputure uses for a 5,500 or a 6,500 Kelvin light, or 5,600 Kelvin light, might be different than the LEDs that Godox is using in a light that's also advertised as 6500 Kelvin, and one may be green and one may be magenta, and then you better have gels to deal with it, because it's just, it's there, it's a problem. And so, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm just overreacting to all of this stuff, but or just over analyzing, I should say, all of this stuff, but I find it tremendously frustrating to deal with video lighting, because you know, it's like you either need a really expensive color meter and to spend a whole pile of money on like a full set of gels and so on and so forth, and I just, it's rather annoying. The other thing, the last thing I wanted to talk about was the Aputure LS 120D Mark II, specifically its brightness range, because I have not seen this brought up anywhere in any of the reviews of the light. So one of the other things that frustrates me immensely about most LED lights is that they, well, that's interesting. I have no idea how that worked. Anyway, or why that happened. But one of the things that frustrates me about most LED lights is they're sold, and they're sold with a dimming range, 100% to 0% or 100% to 20%. And the implication with that is that each percent is a percent. So at 50%, the light's going to be half as bright. At least for me, that's the implication of that. What I was really impressed with the Aputure 120D too is there's nearly 10 stops of dimming range in the 0 to 100% range of the light. And, you know, I mean, and I measured this, whoops, I measured this in looking at, I pulled out my light meter and I measured this because, you know, I'm trying to figure out what it was. And, you know, what I found was that yeah, now I'm getting all distracted. It's messing with my flow. So at 100%, you could call it, say, full power, right? If you dim the light, or if I dim my light to 84%, I'm down 1 stop. And if I go to 63%, I'm down 2 stops. And 53% is 3 stops. And I was very impressed because aside from the first 2 stops, going from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 to 8, all of those were about 10% jumps. I got 9% in some cases, but I think, you know, there's margin in my meter too, because I wasn't looking at lux, I was looking at stops. But, and I was pretty impressed by that, because when I got down to 1% on the light, I was 10 stops down from the maximum brightness of the light, and I did not expect to see that. Now, I would love to see a consistent, say, 10% per stop or something like that across the range of the light, but this is way better than I expected, because just do the math, 3% or 6% is down like 5 stops, and then it's 3%, and then it's like 1.5%, you know, if you're doing it by percents. What this also tells me, or doesn't, I won't say tells me, what this also leads to is one of the problems that I've always had with trying to buy LED lights for videography is figuring out how much power to buy. Because if you're going at percents as percents and not something non-linear, which is apparently what Aputure's doing, then you just don't have a really big dimming range. And it's not, I don't think, terribly unreasonable to think about or to have things going on in the percent is percent range, because a number of the cheap LED panels that I have that I've measured, 50% is about 50% of the light output. 25% is about 25% of the light out. So that's 2 stops right there. You know, you run into that specific, what do I want to say, drop off. So you have to think about sizing a light based on the fact that you're not, in 100% light, you're not going to have more than 6 stops of control roughly, if a percent is a percent is a percent. However, with the Aputure 120Ds, a percent isn't a percent as far as what I'm measuring, and with a 10-stop range, you know, assuming this holds true with the rest of their lights, especially with a 10-stop range, you have a lot more flexibility in picking something. Because for me, at least, when I'm looking at trying to size a light to buy for, you know, general purpose, I'm trying to find something, or I'm looking for something that I'm going to be able to work mostly somewhere that's not either full power or close to 0 power. I want some margin, because if I, you know, need to go shoot outside, or I'm in a lighter environment, or something like that, and, you know, now all of a sudden my camera decides that it just wants to turn off and turn on all the time. I got to replace that EOS webcam utility. I think that's the problem. But anyway, back to what I was saying. If I want to shoot, or I need to work in a slightly brighter environment or slightly dimmer environment, I don't want to be, say, completely stuck at 100% brightness for my normal usage, or completely stuck at 5% brightness for my normal usage. You know, I want to be in the middle. Well, when the middle is a very tight range, say maybe only 6 stops, there's not a lot of margin for that. And when it's like, say, 10 stops, that is actually a lot easier to sort of deal with, or work around, or at least plan with, I should say. And, you know, what's really frustrating about this to me is I looked at a lot of reviews for lights before I picked the light that the Aputure light that I picked. Not one review that I found in all of the stuff that I looked at had a breakdown of light output versus power level settings. And none of the manufacturers, or very few of the manufacturers, because I'm sure somebody does, have a graph or a chart or anything that really talks about the control range of their lights. So, you know, they say 0 to 100%, but they don't tell you how many stops that is, which is really, in many ways, I think, more important, because that's telling you a lot more about brightness as it applies to the videography or photography, or sort of working, as I said. Like I said, when you start getting down into single-digit percents, you have big shifts, or very few percents equate to pretty significant brightness changes. So, you know, so minus 3 stops is 12.5%. Minus 4 stops from full power is 6.25%. Minus 5 stops is 3 1/8. You know, that's a really tiny range. And, you know, like I said, if you're running a 600 watt light, and you have to get down into that end of the power spectrum for one reason or another, you don't have a lot of control. So I have been rambling on at this again for just over an hour, and I actually had some people tune in, it looks like, today, which thank you guys for tuning in. If you're not watching these streams live, my focus, or I'm doing these streams on Friday nights. I'm trying to start them around 10:30. I put up a notification about 24 hours in advance, and before I go live with some updated times, just to like have it out there. But anyway, thanks for watching. As always, please consider subscribing. I have, I'm not just doing live streams. I'm actually doing researched, scripted, thought out, complicated content. So please consider subscribing for that. My big project right now, in fact, is still, I'm working on a very comprehensive review of the EOS R5. In some respects, I'm trying to catch up with the massive pile of content stuff that has come up that I wanted to do. So I've got stuff on lighting, I've got stuff on the EOS R5, I've got stuff coming on resolution, teleconverters, whether you should use a teleconverter or upsample, all those kinds of things. So please consider subscribing. Aside from the live streams, I don't necessarily post things regularly, so if you do subscribe, you may very much want to consider that clicking the notification bell so that you are notified when I'm going to be posting something, because it's not like it's going to it happens with a tremendous amount of regularity. So yeah. As always, again, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time, perhaps next week. Anyway, good night, and see y'all later.